Hello, everyone. It's your favorite time of the week, the Psychology, Culture, and Society lecture. We have finally gotten through the kind of animal model stuff, we've gone through research methods, and now we can actually get to some of the more interesting aspects of cross cultural psychology for most students. So let's jump into it. An overriding theme in this chapter is that cultural norms and cultural differences largely come about through socialization in different environments. Universal brains develop into culturally diverse minds. Humans are not born with a specific set of cultural knowledge and skills, such as how to survive in the Amazonian jungle or trade stocks on Wall Street. Humans are born prepared to learn from any cultural environment. We have inherited compatibilities that enable us to learn these skills very well, so we are prepared to adjust to and gather cultural meaning from any environment we are born into. What is universal is our preparedness for culture, and what is culturally specific is the particular environment that we learn from. So, kind of the idea here, and this is typically talked about in my developmental psychology courses, but kind of just briefly stated, we have universal developmental processes which are in tune to an individual's developmental context. So particular environmental factors shaping an individual's development behaviorally, genetically, and neurologically. And this is usually done through a process on the neurological level through myelination, synaptogenesis, pruning, etc. And also in genetics through epigenetics. And none of those, those terms are really going to be quizzed or going to be on your quiz, but kind of just like callback from previous material that you've learned in other courses. Sensitive periods for cultural socialization. It's a period of time in development when it's easy to acquire a skill. Skill acquisition is subsequent to this period is much more difficult. It's evident across many species and across many domains. Not applicable to all domains of learning in humans, but applies to language and cultural acquisition. There's a relative trade-off between the ability to learn new behaviors for a new environment and the ability to specialize behaviors for specific environments. There are developmental transitions between learning new skills and the specializations of existing skills as indication of the existence of a sensitive period. So kind of the idea here is that there are these sensitive periods, which are, as stated, kind of a period where you are sensitive to your environments. It's a period where rapid development occurs, and this is in the periods of sensitizations are thought to occur universally. But what is different is the environmental inputs to an organism within this sensitive period. And what that allows for, as stated before, is specialization of behavior and your brain development and your genetic expression. So you specialize to the environment in which you are developing in. And there's a trade-off between that, right? Because as you become more specialized in your environment, your ability to learn kind of new and differing behaviors to kind of override those, or replace those behaviors, that neurological development becomes more difficult because you're now outside of that specialization period. Change can occur, but it's just more difficult, and this insensitive periods, again, are periods where rapid development and specialization takes place. Language acquisition. Most research on sensitive periods has studied language acquisition. Language skills are important for survival, so there should be evidence of a sensitive period for language acquisition. One source of evidence is the ability to discriminate different sounds. Sound discrimination is broad at birth, but then narrows during development. Newborn can discriminate units of sound. By 4 days of age, infants already show a preference for sounds from their own language. Within the first year, infants start losing the ability to distinguish between similar sounds that are not used in their own language. So again, this is kind of an example, a classic example of a sensitive period, wherein infants, newborns, I should say, are able to discriminate between sounds across different languages. But through time, as their language neurological symptoms or systems implicated in language development become more specialized, infants lose the ability to discriminate all units of sound within a language. And again, this reflects that specialization. So you kind of have this generalized system of language acquisition, as Noam Chomsky would put it. And with time, specialization occurs due to environmental inputs, aka the language being spoken by your parents, your caregivers, or kind of your household more generally. Laws of phoneme perception. Hindi has two phonemes, a B and an aspirated B, which sound different to native speakers but the same to English speakers, since English makes no such differentiation. This inability to detect a difference has been shown to be predicted by age. Babies of native English speakers of 6 to 8 months of age can distinguish between these two sounds. They are similar in ability to 10 to 12-month-old Hindi infants. However, by 8 to 10 months, their ability starts declining. A good deal of evidence shows that humans are better at acquiring and mastering language at younger ages. Especially for aspects of language such as grammar and language, the capacity for acquisition declines with age. So this is just an empirical example of the declining ability to detect phonemes across all languages. Because again, so it goes back to that trade-off, that specialization, that improved efficiency, and another kind of term from developmental, this automatic processing of language, or really of anything, allows an individual to perform better on particular tasks, and in this case, language production, language understanding, discriminating against phonemes in particular for this study. But the trade-off is that as you become more specialized, you lose kind of the ability to discriminate, in this case, and distinguish more phonemes across all languages. And going back to this argument for a sensitive period during language, you see that there's a linear trajectory with, as an individual spends more time in their environment, their specialization increases, and thus, in this case, English speakers' ability to detect Hindi phonemes decreases. And as kind of everybody knows that interacts with a second language or a third language, the earlier you acquire and master the language, or just kind of work on it, the easier it is. And this is suspected to be because of a sensitive period of language. And this is a visual representation of what we just talked about. And you can see here that with increased age, the ability of infants to, in this case, English infants, to detect differences in Hindi phonemes declined with age, with close to almost 100% of 6 to 8 month-year-olds being able to. But once an infant hits 10 to 12 months old of their experience in that environment, that's 4 to, or really 6 to 4 extra months, is sufficient time for the brain to specialize enough that you see a difference in the ability to detect phonemes in a different language. And there's neural evidence of a sensitive period of language acquisition. Evidence that the brain activation of bilinguals differs depending on the age of second language acquisition. First and second languages are processed in the same regions of the brain if they are learned early on. A second language is processed in a different region if it is acquired much later. So just as the brain is flexible at restructuring itself and accommodating different language inputs, but only during a sensitive period. So kind of the idea here is that the differences, or the sensitive period, is reflected in neurological studies. So fMRI studies can look at correlations between when an individual is exposed to and learns first or second language, and kind of their what parts of the brain are most active when using those languages. And neuroimaging studies indicate that when you learn a language later on in life, your brain, different areas of your brain are more active when expressing that language. So a person learning that language at 1 year old versus 21 years old would have different neurological activity when producing or listening to their second language. And what this suggests is not only specialization, but the brain, again, going back to a developmental psychology term, is plastic. There's neuroplasticity that allows for brains to continue to reflect the environmental inputs throughout life. So even although a sensitive period is a time where most development occurs, there's proposed to be multiple sensitive periods, and in this case, there's evidence that your brain is still neurological activity is still reflecting environmental inputs even outside of that sensitive age. So learning a language at 20 years old is still reflected at a neurological level within your brain activity, but just in a different location. So one traditional way that researchers analyzed or validated the existence of sensitive periods, especially before neuroimaging technology, was kind of these extreme accident or deprivation case studies. So there are real-world cases of children without language input from an early age. 3 children are listed. All 3 had little to no exposure to spoken language growing up. They were never able to grasp the grammatical structures of their respective languages, and moreover, were unable to develop into fully functioning adults. So kind of the idea here is that even though they learned some language, or developed some language compatibilities, or capabilities, I should say, they were still unable to reach the proficiency levels of other of typical developing children who are exposed to typical amounts of language input. So that environmental deprivation occurring across, depending on the child, months or years, contributing to permanent impairments of language production, and specifically grammatical structures. And again, suggesting that there's a sensitive period of language, and that although the brain is plastic and able still to take in environmental inputs, and thus kind of rewire itself in order to allow for language production and understanding. In this case, in these examples, this provides evidence that those developmental delays, those gaps, cannot be fully filled. There's not complete catch-up growth in regards to language acquisition outside of the sensitive period of language acquisition development. Another interesting case study is American Sign Language. So infants, the principles of American Sign Language, the principles of language acquisition applies also to individuals who use sign language. Which is for some individuals, kind of not known, but sign language is a real language with different versions of sign language around the world. It's American Sign Language. There are different kinds of sign language around the world, and it is a real language with its own grammar, structure, etc. And the same principles of language acquisition applies to it, as I stated. So the earlier, the better applies. Mastery of syntax and semantics of sign language was greatest among students exposed to it in infancy and early childhood. Those who learned ACL later in their development, ages 9 to 16, mastered it better if they had some exposure to English early in life than if they had not been exposed to any language system before. Deaf infants whose parents are deaf babble in sign language. Deaf parents communicate using child-directed signs. So kind of, again, the same principles here. The earlier a deaf child is exposed to sign language, the better for their mastery of syntax and semantics. And interestingly, deaf children will babble in sign language if their parents speak sign language. So they're signing to the child, and they'll also sign in kind of child-directed ways. So as parents traditionally, in English at least, use a high-pitched voice or something along those lines, modifying the words they use. Individuals speaking American Sign Language do similar things and use similar methods to communicate with a child learning sign language. And thus you see them babbling in sign language just like a child would babble in English, Spanish, or whatever other spoken language. Continuing on with sign language, home sign shows the influence of nature and nurture on language. a system of signs invented by children who are deaf and born of hearing parents and therefore receive no language input. They never develop a full language if not exposed to sign languages. In cross-cultural examples, a group of deaf children in a school in Nicaragua whose teachers could not sign invented a way to communicate through made-up signs. So this is an interesting case study where children in Nicaragua who did not have access to a sign language native to their culture kind of created a language. It's disputed on how close it is to a language, but scientists generally agree that year after year, as this language that they've created, or this method of communicating that they created, is closer and closer to a language similar to ASL, for example. So again, this kind of speaks to the necessity and of language as a critical component of the human species. So with that said, other researchers have tried to find a kind of a similar sensitive period to acculturation. So some researchers argue that immigration before age 15, an individual greater identification with Canadian culture as one spends more time in Canada. So this is a study in Canada looking at immigrants, and the researchers found and argued that there was greater identification with Canadian culture as one spends more time in Canada. And immigration after age 15, no relationship between time spent in Canada and Canadian identification. Suggestion that 15 years of age is the end of its sensitive period for identifying with another culture. However, other researchers have found no sensitive period for acculturation, so the question should be further tested. So, although one study found it, this has not been consistently replicated, and there might be other factors kind of influencing the likelihood of acculturation, or to the extent that a sensitive period occurs, other factors maybe elongating that sensitive period, or maybe there's multiple sensitive periods for acculturation. We just don't know. Researchers have also looked at cultural psychological differences with age. Because humans acquire culture as they are socialized, cultural differences should increase with age. Younger children across cultures should be relatively similar because there has been relatively little socialization. Adults should show greater cultural differences due to more time for socialization. Chinese and Canadian 7-year-olds are more similar in thoughts about the future than 7 and 11-year-olds from either country. There is cultural divergence with age and explanations of others' behaviors, optimism, and tendency to focus on positive aspects of the self. So kind of the idea here is that similar to this sensitive period of language where a young child can recognize all phonemes and thus all children's ability to recognize all phonemes are relatively similar or exactly the same across all cultures. And the idea here is similar, where young children across cultures being similar because they really haven't had time for specialization, in this case cultural specialization, because they've had relatively less socialization. Well, some researchers have found that, as I stated, Chinese and Canadian 7-year-olds are more similar in their thoughts about the future than 7 and 11-year-olds from either country. So the idea here is that as an individual grows up in their particular cultural context, they're acquiring culture, and the longer they are acquiring culture, the more specialization occurs, and the higher likelihood you will find psychological differences being fostered by these cultural differences or time spent in those different cultures. A realm of research or a particular area of mother-child dyad interactions are infants' personal space. So one key source of cultural practices guiding development is infants' interactions with their parents. These researchers argue that any difference found in infants' interaction with their mothers is of great importance. Interactions mark the beginning of a children's socialization process. So again, the more you're exposed to socialization, the more your brain, or your indoor behaviors and possibly genetic specialization occurs, or I should say genetic expression specialization occurs, thus examining these children's interactions with their parents. And in this study that we're going to look at, mother-infant interactions is important for understanding the acquisition of culture. Mothers from some cultures engage in more physical contact with their infants than mothers from other cultures. Mothers from some cultures also spend much more time in face-to-face interaction contexts with their children. So you can see on the chart that almost 100% basically of Cameroonians, the percent of time in bodily contact, so the dyads and mother infants, their interaction, their level of touch is constant compared to German dyads, which is a little over 25%. Infants from some Western countries tend to have more interactive experiences with their mothers that seem related to the rate of acquiring certain developmental skills, such as turn-taking in conversation and self-recognition in a mirror. Level of responsiveness to infant vocalization, mirroring of child's expressions. Infants from some regions of Africa, the Caribbean, and India receive cultural experiences such as daily massages and exercise regimes that seem related to the rate of children's physical development and activities such as crawling, sitting on their own, and walking at an earlier age. Stretching, sitting, sleeping on their stomach. So kind of the idea here is that dyads don't just differ in their level of physical touch, but also how they interact with a child. So Westerners tend to have more interactive experiences, which may contribute to an earlier age in which infants are able to recognize themselves in the mirror, or a kind of specific socialization skills that center around interactive experiences. And we also see different types of not just physical contact, but kind of like active physical contact. So massages and particular exercise regimes may be contributing to children's motor development a little quicker in age than other Western cultures. Sleeping arrangements. Several surveys have found variability in sleeping arrangement across cultures. Co-sleeping, which is the practice of children sleeping in the parents' beds. There's cultural variability in children's sleeping arrangements. Most societies, 2/3, co-sleep. In the majority of other cases, infants are in the same room but in a different bed. Out of 100 societies studied, the United States was the only society to create a separate room for the baby. However, within the United States, there is also variation in children's sleeping arrangements. Co-sleeping is common among subcultures including Asian Americans, African Americans, and Hispanic Americans. The practice of sleeping in separate beds, however, has not yet been identified in any subsistence societies worldwide. It demonstrates that practice that is so typical in most of North America is actually very unusual worldwide. Such practices become so entrenched that they become moralized, with people evaluating others' choices as either right or wrong. Acting to the contrary suggests abnormal parent-parent or parent-child relationships. Sleeping arrangements can be seen not as a matter of personal choice, but rather as a behavior that reflects morality. Moral judgments often reflect the cultural underlying values. So kind of this typical example that we all understand in a Western context, or at least, the majority do. As I said before, there's cultural variation within the United States, but kind of the traditional white American way of arranging bedrooms, where there's separate beds and separate rooms for young children, are not found in subsistence societies worldwide. And these differences, in sleeping arrangements, are so commonly found that individuals will moralize these cross-cultural differences, with either the child sleeping in the same bed or the child sleeping in a different bed or a different room, morally correct or morally wrong, depending on your particular culture. So let's talk about some empirical evidence for sleeping arrangements. Preferences for sleeping arrangements may be due to prioritizing of different values across cultures. One study found that Indians and Americans, they asked Indian Americans to plan sleeping arrangements for a hypothetical family, and participants in the two groups focused on different values when deciding who sleeps together. And what did the researchers find? Well, they found that the two groups focused on different values when deciding who sleeps together. Indian participants tended to view each of the three arrangements as the best solution 47% of the time. However, not a single American participant in the study viewed the arrangement 1 or 2 as the best solution, and 88% of Americans considered arrangement 3 to be the best. And when asked the sleeping arrangements and what were the values underlying those sleeping arrangements, Indians valued the following in descending order: incest avoidance, protection of the vulnerable, female chastity anxiety, and respect for hierarchy. In contrast, Americans valued the following: incest avoidance, sacred couple, and autonomy ideal. So you can see that autonomy ideal and this sacred couple were not even listed as a value within the Indian population within this study. So you can see some kind of, or some universal properties of sleeping arrangement, that is incest avoidance, but with different cultures valuing other values, not at all, or more importantly, in the U.S., more kind of this autonomy ideal and the sacredness of the couple, versus for Indians, kind of a protection of the vulnerable and respect for hierarchy, where they post-pubescent males have a social status, or given social status, I should say, by not having to sleep with their parents. Attachment theory, and you should remember this from your developmental psychology courses and really your general psychology courses. Infants and parents are biologically prepared to have close attachments with each other. Developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth studied attachment behaviors in Uganda and the United States. The straight situation procedure is used to examine how children react to the situation in which their mother leaves the room and leaves them alone with a stranger and then return. So kind of the idea here is that you put a mother and child in this kind of unfamiliar room, and they stay there for X amount of minutes, typically like 5-10 minutes. So the mother and child are acclimated to that room, and then the mother leaves the room, and while the mother is gone, and a stranger enters the room and then leaves the room, and then the mother re-enters the room. Researchers the entire time are filming this interactions, and then they code how the child reacts when the mother returns to the room. And based on how the child acts, they get assigned to a set category. And what are those categories? Or better said, the styles of attachment. The first is secure attachment, which the infant occasionally seeks the mother when she is around and seeks her presence more after being left alone. Infant is confident and explores a new environment with the mother present. We have avoidant attachment, which infant shows little distress as the mother's absence and avoids her on her return. Anxious ambivalent attachment. Infant shows frequent distress when the mother is present or absent, sometimes wants to be close, but often, after being near the parent, will resist or push her away. And a fourth attachment style, which was later identified as disorganized attachment, behaviors that could not clearly be categorized into one of three styles. Unsurprisingly, the majority of research on attachment has been conducted with Americans. Studies show that secure attachment is the most common, followed by avoidant attachment and anxious ambivalent attachment. Similar studies in other cultures have found similar distribution of attachment styles. Most of the literature describes secure attachment as the ideal. So kind of the idea here is that you want your child to be securely attached, and if they're not securely attached, there are potential long-term developmental consequences. And the idea is traditionally thought, well, this is a kind of a universal phenomenon wherein secure attachment produces the most positive developmental outcomes across cultures. A study in northern Germany found that the most common attachment style was avoidant attachment, and this was viewed as the ideal. Northern German mothers associate avoidance with signs of early independence, a culturally valued trait. Israeli kibbutz set up a system of communal childcare to free the adults to spend more time doing economically productive work. Children raised in the most traditional forms of the kibbutz, starting at 3 months, spent their entire days and nights, with the exception of a 3-hour dinner break with their parents, in a communal environment with a caregiver and several other children in their age. The most common form of attachment was anxious ambivalent. Some studies have found no avoidant attachment in Japanese samples and among the Dogon in West Africa, where infants are in constant proximity to their parents. This wide range of infant caregiving experience around the world calls into question certain assumptions of attachment theory, particularly in non-Western cultural contexts. So rather than these attachments being universal, they seem to be kind of more context-specific, with certain types of attachments not existing, and certain attachment styles being related to positive outcomes within a particular culture. So as stated in this Northern German study, they found that avoidance attachment was the most culturally desired form of attachment in infants. And I should include young adults. And also in different communities where children are raised in more communal environments with caregivers and other children their age, this is kind of different than a traditional Western style of child rearing. You see different forms of attachment develop, and different styles of attachment being more valued across cultures. There are traditionally thought to be 4 styles of parenting: authoritarian parenting, which is high demands on the children, strict rules, little open parent-child dialogue, and parent-centered; authoritative parenting, high expectations of maturity, understanding of a child's feelings, independence encouraged within limits, parental warmth and responsiveness, child-oriented; permissive parenting, which is lots of dialogue, few limits or controls, lots of parental warmth and responsiveness; neglectful parenting, marked by parents being cold, unresponsive, and indifferent to their children. So again, kind of the traditional idea here is that authoritarian parenting promote the best long-term developmental outcomes, and other ones, especially neglectful parenting, typically associated with the worst developmental outcomes, and the other two also being associated with poor developmental outcomes. That's kind of the traditional model of parenting style theorized within Western context. And there is support for this within Western samples that shows that authoritarian parenting yields the best outcome. It's typically associated with school achievement, perceived parental warmth, acceptance, independence, and self-reliance. However, other researchers argue that the typical categorization patterns of parenting may be laden with Western notions of development and may not capture parenting styles in other cultures. It is common in many other cultures to have a strict, parent-centered parenting style, but these do not fit neatly into this traditional idea of an authoritarian parenting style. Different parental approaches are used at different stages of the child's development. So not only is this authoritarian style or particular styles of parent-centered parenting style may not fit nicely or neatly on a conceptual level or on a statistical level within an authoritarian parenting style, research supports that different parenting approaches are used at different stages of the child's development. So it's not just that you decide that you're an authoritarian parent and then you're just authoritarian forever, but rather parents adjusting their parenting style as the child develops. In many Asian cultures, parenting style changes according to the child's stage of development, with infants and toddlers being shown indulgence, but parents becoming stricter as the child reach school age. So just as I stated. Parents communicate warmth and responsiveness differently across cultures. Western cultures are provide more explicit communication of parental warmth, such as physical affection and telling children they love them, but more implicit communications are found in Asian societies, such as striving to meet their children's fundamental needs. The authoritarian style excludes the parental role of training that is common in Chinese and other non-Western parenting styles. This authoritarian style fails to capture these nuances of culturally specific notions of parenting styles. Some parenting styles predict different outcomes across cultures. Strong parental control is associated with increased family cohesion, perceived parental warmth, and acceptance in academic achievement in East Asian, but it is associated with fewer positive outcomes in Western countries. So I should also add that even within Western contexts, different subcultures have different developmental outcomes associated with different parenting styles. And that can be due to a host of environmental factors and also just a general acceptance that this style of parenting is common, and it does not mean that your caregiver or family hates you or whatever. So it can reflect a variety of environmental factors and kind of just understanding that this is a normative practice that takes place between parents and children, or caregivers and families, communities, and their children. Noun bias. Children's tendency to think more about and in terms of nouns relative to verbs and other relation words. Once assumed to be universal, but little evidence for it in cultural groups besides North Americans. Chinese toddlers use more verbs than nouns. Also, there is no evidence of noun bias among Korean toddlers. So this is, again, traditionally thought to be a universal process. And this is one of the limitations to limiting your samples to Western samples and then drawing broad conclusions. So what once was thought to be universal is found to be more context specific, with again Chinese toddlers and Korean toddlers not having evidence of this noun bias. And what is one possible explanation for this is that while English syntax makes nouns salient, other languages makes verbs more salient. Empirical evidence suggests that Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans also allow for nouns and pronouns to be dropped from a sentence when the context is clear, making the verb the most important part of a sentence. For example, saying just love instead of I love you, in this example, the subject I can be dropped. Another possible explanation, kind of outside of the realms of the grammatical structure of language, is that young children communicate about objects differently across cultures. While North American mothers focus on objects as independent agents, East Asian mothers portray objects as they relate to other objects. So for example, it's a yellow truck with black wheels versus here comes daddy truck saying hello to brother truck. The difference leads children to attend to different things. And over time, this difference in the emphasis of how objects relate to each other, either independent or interdependent, contributes to a bias within certain types of words. So in Western samples or North American samples, as I say, a noun bias, and compared to other East Asian samples, such as Chinese and Korean toddlers that we covered, that when a mother or a father interacts with a child, and interacts and plays with a child in a way that emphasizes the interdependence or the relation of objects to each other, it contributes to certain biases within their speech, as it does in North American mother-child interactions. Another classic example is the terrible twos, which are a developmental milestone in the West. They're marked by increase in resistance, oppositional behavior, important for children to assert autonomy and individuality, and seen as the foundation for future mature relationships. However, terrible twos are not seen universally, not as evident among the Aka Pygmies of Central Africa, where children are held by caregivers for much of the day, and also not seen among the Mayas in Guatemala. Such as terrible twos rarely occur in the absence of parental interactions to encourage a sense of individualism and independence. Some cultures view noncompliance as immaturity rather than a step toward personal growth. So kind of this idea of the way caregivers interact with their child, promoting particular cultures or values of a particular culture, contributing to the likelihood of terrible twos. And in cultures where noncompliance and independence and autonomy are less valued, you see less likelihood of the onset of terrible twos occurring in a 2-year-old. Another perceived universal phenomenon is adolescent risk-taking. Well, a study looked at over 175 pre-industrialized studies to kind of test the idea, is risk-taking across adolescence inevitable? Is it universal? Researchers discovered evidence for both similarities and differences. All the cultures viewed adolescence as a distinct period of life, separate from childhood and adolescence, in which some restructuring and role learning occurred. The expectation for antisocial behavior was present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys, and only 18% for girls. The majority of the cultures studied did not expect teenagers to be disobedient. Notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. Only 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and 3% had such expectations for girls. Some factors that predict existence of adolescent rebellion appear to be individualism and modernity. Individuals in the range of available roles in adulthood may contribute to adolescent distress. People are slower to take on adult roles in more individualistic cultures, which increases the stress and confusion of adolescents. So kind of going back to this idea, is adolescent risk-taking universal? And, and the researchers found, after reviewing 175 pre-industrialized society, no, that is not the case. And there are environmental factors that are suspected to predict the likelihood of adolescent risk-taking, and that is cultures that stress individualism and the level choices for a adult or an emerging adult could contribute to adolescent distress, because you can imagine yourself working in a farming community, and really there being little to no interaction outside of your community. Thus, there are very limited roles in which you could choose to take part in. Thus, that kind of eliminates, that stress of what do I do, because there's kind of less options. And thus, you see kind of adults in these individualized, industrialized countries experiencing higher stress related to that confusion of what roles to take in adulthood. And even there's kind of this notion that males are expected to be more violent than females, and that is found across cultures, but at a kind of a super minority level, with only 13% of societies expecting adolescent boys to be occasionally violent, and only 3% for adolescent girls. Socialization through education. Question. In a group of 4 objects, a hammer, a saw, wooden logs, and an axe, what object does not belong? How did you eliminate the choice? How did you draw your conclusions? Well, Loria, who is a kind of in the Vygotsky school of developmental thought, posed the same question to people without formal education in Uzbekistan, or in rural Russia, I should say, in 1976, or Soviet Union at the time. Groupings could be done by either relationship or shared attributes. For people with formal education, the task is more straightforward. Solving the problem by saying the tool doesn't belong requires people to form an abstract category from common attributes in the sets of objects. People without formal schooling in the study did not necessarily rely on the use of abstract concepts over personal experience or familiarity. So kind of the idea here is not that these cultures do not have the ability to sort these items within kind of traditional ways that we think they should be sorted, aka based on abstract rules of categories, that is, tools. So the hammer, the saw, and the axe going together, and the wooden logs not belonging. But rather, in these cultures, they stress the kind of the interdependence of these items, and also the a particular group's understanding of how those items interact or should be used together, because knowledge is typically thought to be held by the elders and or respective members of a community, and that knowledge is passed on to them through kind of scaffolding or socialization practices. Thus, it's impossible to know on a universal level which of those 4 items go together. While people in, going through the American school system, we're taught that a particular way of sorting those items based on particular way, which is an abstract categorization. And people without formal schooling are less likely to use that sorting categories over personal experience or familiarity. There's evidence across a variety of cultures that shows that formal education encourages people to think abstractly and go beyond knowledge derived from direct experience, affects people's ability to create taxonomic categories based on some shared attribute or role, and predicts higher IQ scores on an intelligence test. Studies on formal education underscore how the concept of intelligence is intertwined with cognitive skills acquired through cultural learning. So kind of the idea here is that the more familiar you are with formal schooling, the more you are taught and particular categorization techniques, but also the more you acquire a particular style of learning, a culturally specific style of learning within it allows you to perform well on particular tasks, typically designed in a Western context. So intelligence test or kind of just abstract knowledge tests. And you see improvements of, as I stated, you see improvements in task performance the more a individual within a culture is exposed to formal education. So again, it's not that they're incapable of doing it, it's just that cultures value us, have different values, which are reflective in their cognitive strategies and specifically their categorization, their taxonomical categorization strategies. Another interest in case studies is East Asians in math education. Scores in East Asian schools were more similar, that is, they're less spread out to each other than to American schools. There were more similarities among East Asian schools than in U.S. schools. On average, students in East Asian schools performed much better than students in U.S. schools. Cultural differences became more pronounced as children received more education in respective educational systems. So the idea here is that there's more variability in math scores within American schools, and we kind of know this through personal experience or kind of interacting with the world, that there are some good schools, some bad schools, and there's more variability. Well, the study found that East Asian schools are more consistently, there's less variability. They're more similar to each other. And interestingly, the differences between math education and Asians increased with age, thus suggesting that cultural values of education and just cultural differences overall, which may reflect different environmental factors, contribute to and create more of differences between the two groups with time, because those environmental factors accumulate. The effects of those environmental factors accumulate, leading to larger differences over time. The authors propose several explanations for these differences in math education. The first is math is taught differently between cultures. The school days in session, percentage of class time devoted to math, amount of homework, time lecturing in the classroom, and use of real-world examples. Cultural differences in the value of education among both mothers and children. Asians seem to view education as more central to their children's lives than do American parents. How high mothers' expectations for their children differs between cultures. And East Asian numbering systems lend themselves to be manipulated and understood more easily than does the English numbering systems. So we have kind of different proposals here. We have some that are based on how the math is taught between schools, with more time spent in the classroom and at home in East Asian samples. And we also have different views of education, with Asians within this study viewing education as a more central part of their children's lives than American parents, which is reflected in studies that ask different parents, what are your expectations for your child in a course, but in this case, math education, with American parents on average having lower expectations for their child within a particular course. And then you have more kind of this structural kind of approach or theorized explanation, wherein the basic structure of how the numbers systems exist within particular cultures, increasing or decreasing the ability to master mathematics, because it's easier. Some are more easier to be manipulated and understood than others. So let's wrap this up with an empirical example. Fifth graders were asked to imagine a wizard who would grant them any wish. 70% of wishes listed by Chinese children had to do with education. 10% of American kids wished for things related to education. And the most common wish among those 10% was less school. When mothers were asked to state the minimum standard to earn performance satisfaction, American mothers gave a number considerably below the level at which they expected their child to perform, and East Asian mothers gave a number considerably higher than the level at which they expected their child to perform. So kind of what I said before, and also you see this additional study with this wizard example, where the Chinese children in this sample wishing for education at much higher rates than American children. And among the children who did wish or talk about education as a wish, the majority of them wished it for less school. In summary, we are born ready to acquire any language and culture, but a sensitive period limits what we can learn easily. Different cultural practices, such as parent-child interactions and sleeping arrangements, begin to in our experience very early in life. Cultural differences in socialization experiences, particularly from parenting and formal education, are pervasive and become more pronounced as people age. And that's all for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great week. Thanks a lot. Bye.